Chapter 1. The Forgotten Patient. The air inside Site-42's high-risk containment wing was unnaturally still. The hum of flickering fluorescent lights cast a pale glow over the sterile metallic corridors, the scent of antiseptic and something ancient lingering in the air. Dr. Eleanor Voss pulled her lab coat tighter around her shoulders, suppressing the involuntary chill crawling up her spine. She had been assigned some strange cases before, but SCP-014, the concrete man, was something different. She swiped her clearance card over the reinforced containment door. It beeped, and with a heavy hiss, the security lock disengaged. Inside, SCP-014 sat perfectly still on a metal chair, his pale, cracked skin blending into the cold gray walls. His body looked like something half forgotten by time, frozen, unmoving, with deep fissures running along his arms and neck like veins of marble. But his eyes, they were alert, alive, almost amused. "Ah," his voice was dry, like stone grinding against stone. "A new observer." Dr. Voss hesitated before stepping closer, tablet in hand. "I'm Dr. Eleanor Voss. I'll be leading your case study." SCP-014 tilted his head. The sound of his movements was disturbingly unnatural, like old concrete settling after years of strain. "I have had many observers." He smiled, his lips cracked apart like breaking rock. "None have stayed long." The man who would not move. Eleanor glanced at his file on the tablet. No biological functions detected, no cellular decay, no confirmed origin of anomaly. Yet SCP-014 insisted he was human. He claimed to be a 19th century aristocrat, but records of his existence before his immortalization were inconclusive at best, outright missing at worst. "Tell me," Eleanor said, keeping her voice clinical. "You claim to be unable to move, and yet you do not require food, water, or sleep. How do you explain that?" SCP-014's grin widened. "Oh, Doctor, you are mistaken. I am not unable to move." Eleanor frowned. "You refuse to." The lights flickered. SCP-014's grin faded slightly. "I simply know better than to move. I once walked freely. I once danced, laughed, ran under the sun, and then one day, the stone inside me woke up." The air felt heavier. Eleanor's fingers tightened around the tablet. "And what happened?" SCP-014's golden eyes gleamed. "Everywhere I stepped, the ground beneath my feet forgot to be soft. It became like me. The people who touched me, they forgot how to move. They forgot how to breathe. They became stone, too." Eleanor swallowed. "You mean—" "Doctor," SCP-014 interrupted, leaning forward just slightly, enough for the air itself to grow dense, like the weight of a mountain pressing against the room. His voice was barely a whisper. "I am not the curse." The room grew colder. "The stone beneath us is waking up. It remembers." Eleanor's breath hitched. The security camera overhead sparked, just for a second. Then everything was normal again. SCP-014 smiled as if nothing had happened. "Tell me, Doctor, how long do you think you will last?" Eleanor took a slow step back, pulse hammering against her ribs. Outside the containment chamber, Agent Henry Cross was waiting. His sharp eyes flickered to her pale face. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eleanor exhaled sharply. "Worse," she muttered. "I think we just woke something up." Chapter 2. The Living Statue. The observation room outside SCP-014's containment chamber was eerily quiet, the hum of the facility's ventilation system the only sound accompanying Dr. Eleanor Voss as she replayed the footage of their interaction. She paused the video at the moment the security camera glitched. For exactly 0.7 seconds, the camera had distorted. The image wavered, static buzzing over the feed, and in that brief moment, SCP-014 had moved. His posture had shifted. Not much, but enough. Enough to prove that he was not truly immobile. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "He's lying," she muttered under her breath. From the doorway, Agent Henry Cross leaned against the frame, arms crossed. "Yeah, well, most of them do," he said. "Why do you look like you've seen the devil himself?" She turned the tablet toward him, rewinding the footage. She pointed. "Right there." He moved. Cross squinted. "I don't see it." She let the video play frame by frame. There, his fingers had changed position. The stone-like creases on his neck had shifted. It was nearly imperceptible, but it was real. Cross exhaled through his nose. "Well, that's unsettling." Eleanor rubbed her temples. "He says the stone is waking up, whatever that means." Cross let out a dry chuckle. "Right. And my grandpa said the radio waves were turning his chickens into spies. You spend enough time around these things, Doc, and you'll start hearing a lot of crazy." Eleanor wasn't so sure. The symptoms begin. Later that evening, Eleanor continued her research, running tests on the air quality inside SCP-014's containment unit. If he wasn't moving, but still causing distortions, maybe there was an unseen factor at play. She had just begun logging her findings when a message popped up on her screen. "Emergency medical report. Researcher, Adam Keller. Status, unresponsive. Transferred to quarantine." Eleanor's blood ran cold. She rushed down the hall to the medical wing. The air smelled wrong, like old, damp earth, the kind of scent that clung to forgotten ruins. Inside, she found Dr. Malcolm Rains, her senior and, unfortunately, her supervisor, hovering over Adam Keller's bed. Keller lay stiffly, his breathing shallow. His skin was gray, not the pallor of sickness, but the texture of rough stone. His fingers had hardened, cracks spreading up his arms like veins. "What the hell happened?" Eleanor demanded. Dr. Rains turned to her, face grim. "It started a few hours after his shift ended. He said he felt stiff, then his fingers went numb. It spread fast." Eleanor's heart pounded. "He never touched SCP-014. Dr. Rains was silent for a long moment. Then, he gestured toward the camera feed in the corner. The footage showed Keller outside SCP-014's chamber. He had been logging data, completely normal, except for one moment. The camera flickered. When it stabilized, Keller stumbled backward, as if something unseen had brushed against him. It was the same glitch Eleanor had seen earlier. "I need to talk to 14, she muttered. The warning. Eleanor stood before SCP-014 again, this time with a tightness in her chest she couldn't shake. The concrete man smiled as if he had been expecting her. "Doctor," he greeted smoothly. "You look troubled." Eleanor stepped forward, keeping her expression controlled. "One of my colleagues is showing signs of petrification. He was outside your containment room earlier today." SCP-014 nodded slowly. "Yes, I can feel them now. The whispers beneath the stone." Eleanor clenched her jaw. "You mean this is coming from you?" SCP-014 exhaled, a sound like a landslide shifting. "No, Doctor, not from me." His golden eyes gleamed under the dim light. "I told you before. The stone remembers. The stone hungers." The containment walls seemed to shudder. "I was merely the first," he continued, voice eerily calm. "The first to understand what happens when you listen. When you stop moving, when you stop resisting, the stone welcomes you home." A terrible chill settled into Eleanor's bones. The security camera in the corner glitched again, static rippling across the feed. SCP-014 smiled. "Doctor," he whispered, "how long do you think you have left?" Chapter 3. The Stone Plague. The Containment Breach. The emergency alarms wailed through Site-42's corridors. Red warning lights flickered along the walls as personnel scrambled to their stations. Dr. Eleanor Voss shoved her way through the rushing chaos toward the quarantine ward, her heart pounding. Researcher Adam Keller was missing. She burst through the doorway, skidding to a halt. The bed where he had been restrained was empty, except for a hardened, human-shaped husk of stone lying in the sheets like a discarded shell. A trail of deep, cracked footprints led from the bed to the doorway. Her fingers dug into the metal of the doorframe. No, 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 no. A blood-curdling scream echoed down the hall. Eleanor ran. She turned the corner and stopped dead. Adam Keller was standing in the middle of the hallway. Or at least, what was left of him. His face was a frozen mask of terror, his mouth locked in a silent scream. His skin was no longer flesh but stone. His body, cracked like an ancient statue, was moving, not walking, not breathing, but shifting, like unseen hands were controlling him. The lights overhead flickered. The stone shell that had once been Adam Keller turned its head toward Eleanor. It took a step. The ground beneath her rumbled. Something in the foundation walls. Agent Henry Cross arrived moments later, his gun drawn. Jesus Christ! Eleanor stood frozen. He's still moving. Cross grabbed his radio. Security, we have an active SCP breach. Subject 14, related. We need a full lockdown on... The lights died. For 3 full seconds, there was only silence. Then the walls groaned. Not from the alarms, not from the facility infrastructure. The concrete walls themselves shifted. A horrible cracking sound filled the corridor, like something ancient and heavy was waking up beneath them. The air thickened, growing cold and still. Then, through the dim glow of the emergency lights, they saw the faces. Not human faces. Carved into the wall. Hundreds of them. Silent, watching. Cross grabbed Eleanor's arm, pulling her back. We need to move. Now. Eleanor didn't argue. They ran. Behind them, the stone husk of Adam Keller followed, slowly, stiffly, but surely. The truth about SCP-014. They slammed the containment room door shut behind them, locking themselves inside with Dr. Malcolm Rains. Rains was standing at the main terminal, typing frantically. Security cameras across the facility showed more signs of the stone spreading, cracks running through the floors, personnel freezing in place mid-step, their flesh turning gray. Cross pointed his gun at Rains. What the hell is going on? Rains didn't look up. Containment is failing. The process has begun. Eleanor stepped forward. You knew this would happen, didn't you? He sighed. It was only a matter of time. The Foundation thought it could contain 14, but they never understood what he really is. On the monitor, a live feed showed SCP-014 still seated in his chamber, unmoving, smiling. 14 was never just one man, Rains continued. He's part of something, older, something the Foundation buried a long time ago, beneath this facility. Eleanor's stomach turned. What are you saying? Rains exhaled, rubbing his temples. You think 14 is turning into stone? He looked at them with tired, haunted eyes. You're wrong. The stone is just waking up. And when it does, so will everything buried with it. The screen glitched again. SCP-014's lips moved, but no sound came through. Instead, something behind them creaked. They turned. The walls breathed. The faces inside the stone shifted, mouths stretching open, whispering something too low to hear. Ross cursed. I'm not dying in this place. Eleanor turned back to Rains. How do we stop it? He shook his head. We don't. We either run or we become part of it. The whispering grew louder, and then the walls cracked open, and something crawled out. Chapter 4. Awakening the Stone God. The facility crumbles. The ground beneath Site-42 convulsed, shaking like a living, breathing thing. Dr. Eleanor Voss, Agent Henry Cross, and Dr. Malcolm Rains barely kept their footing as cracks splintered through the floors, the sound of grinding stone filling the air. SCP-014 was moving. For the first time in over a century, he stood, and the entire facility felt it. The whispers in the walls swelled into a thunderous chant, no longer a distant murmur but a single, unified voice, something ancient and incomprehensible. The stone figures, once human Foundation personnel, turned their heads in perfect unison, their lifeless expressions fixed on SCP-014. Their mouths moved, but the voice that came from them was not their own. The stone has awakened? Eleanor gritted her teeth, backing away from the anomaly's containment chamber, but there was nowhere to run. The walls of Site-42 bulged outward, as though something beneath the surface was pushing against reality itself. The underground tomb was opening. Cross reloaded his weapon, even though he knew bullets were useless. "Tell me you have a plan, Doc." Rain's face was pale, his lips barely moving. "We were never meant to survive this." The revelation. SCP-014 turned his head toward them. His face was no longer human. The golden veins running through his stone-like body pulsed as if something inside him was breathing. His mouth was motionless, yet his voice echoed from the walls themselves. "You hear it now, Doctor?" Eleanor's vision blurred. For a split second, she saw something beyond the walls. A city buried beneath the earth, a place where the buildings themselves were alive, carved from an endless, shifting monolith, stretching farther than the human mind could comprehend. At the center of it all, something was waiting. Something that remembered the world before humans. "I was only the first to return," SCP-014 whispered. "But I am not the last." The walls shattered. From the fractures in the Foundation, monolithic hands pushed through, enormous stone fingers clawing their way out, their jagged surfaces covered in writhing faces. Eleanor screamed, stumbling backward as one of the hands reached for her, the stone shifting as if it were flesh. Cross grabbed her wrist, yanking her away just before the fingers closed around air. "We need to move," he barked. No escape. The corridors of Site-42 were collapsing. The ceiling cracked apart, revealing something moving just above the surface, not metal, not concrete, but ancient, living stone. The entire facility was no longer a building. It was becoming part of SCP-014. "Where's the failsafe detonation?" Cross shouted over the chaos. Eleanor turned to Rains, who stood frozen. "Where, Malcolm?" Rains's eyes flickered between them and SCP-014, whose gaze burned with golden light. Finally, Rains pointed. "Below Sublevel 6, the seismic charge is wired into the Foundation. If we trigger it, the entire facility will collapse." Cross pulled Eleanor along. "Then we need to get there now." Eleanor barely had time to react before SCP-014 raised his hand. The air became impossibly heavy. Eleanor's legs locked up, her body stiffening. She could feel her veins turning cold, as though something was rewriting her from the inside out. Cross grabbed her shoulders, shaking her. "Eleanor, stay with me." Her fingers cracked, gray lines spreading along her skin. She was turning into stone. But then, a voice. "Move." The moment shattered. Eleanor gasped for breath, stumbling forward. Rains's eyes were wide. "He let you go?" Eleanor didn't stop to question it. "We need to end this." The descent into oblivion. They ran. Past the statues of their former colleagues, past the walls that no longer held shape, past the hands crawling from the earth. Everything was collapsing, but the fail-safe control was still intact. Cross reached the panel first, typing in the manual override. "Once I flip this switch, we'll have 10 seconds to get the hell out." Eleanor nodded, her heart pounding. Behind them, SCP-014 watched. The entire facility was becoming his domain. The countdown began. 10. The ground rumbled. 9. The stone figures turned their heads toward them. 8. Cracks spread up Eleanor's legs. She was running out of time. 7. A massive stone limb burst through the corridor, blocking their exit. 6. Cross raised his gun and fired uselessly. 5. Rains hesitated, looking back at SCP-014, his face unreadable. 4. Eleanor grabbed the detonator. 3. She met SCP-014's golden gaze. You cannot stop the stone. Her finger hovered over the switch. She pressed it. Collapse. The blast consumed everything. The world turned white-hot, then black. The weight of tons of rock and steel caved in, burying Site-42 and everything inside it. Silence followed. The monolith. Somewhere in the wilderness, a lone structure remained. It wasn't there before. A massive stone monolith, untouched by the destruction. It bore SCP-014's face, expressionless, watching, waiting. Chapter 5. The Last Stand. The end begins. The facility was collapsing. The whispering from the walls had grown into an overwhelming chorus of voices, not screaming, not crying, just chanting in a language that wasn't human. The stone figures that had once been Foundation personnel were everywhere, standing in rigid, frozen clusters, their cracked mouths murmuring in unison. They weren't attacking. Not yet. They were waiting. In the center of it all, still seated calmly in his chair, was SCP-014. His body had almost fully transformed, no longer resembling a man but something monolithic, his veins webbed with golden cracks, his eyes glowing like molten light beneath the surface of a tomb. As Dr. Eleanor Voss, Agent Henry Cross, and Dr. Malcolm Raines stood just outside his chamber, the walls around them continued to crumble. "We have to end this," Eleanor said. Cross reloaded his weapon. "What the hell do you suggest? You heard Raines. He's not just a man anymore. This thing is waking up, and when it does—" Raines interrupted. "We blow the facility." Cross's head snapped toward him. "What?" "The Foundation knew this was a possibility," Raines said grimly. "There's a Level 5 emergency failsafe, an underground seismic charge. It's meant for containment breaches beyond control. If we trigger it—" Eleanor's breath caught. "The entire site goes down." Raines nodded. "We bury 14 and everything underneath him." The ground shook violently. Stone limbs began clawing their way out of the walls, faces breaking through the floors, fingers stretching from cracks. They had seconds. The descent into hell. Cross sprinted down the hall toward the failsafe control panel. Eleanor and Raines followed, dodging falling debris as the stone plague consumed the facility. From behind them, the whispering voices turned into a single, unified command. Lips. The sound alone made Eleanor's bones ache. Her vision swam, her limbs locked up, heavy as lead. She turned. SCP-014 was standing now. Or rather, something wearing the last remnants of his form. His mouth didn't move, but his voice filled the room. "You cannot run from what you are." Eleanor forced herself forward, every step agonizing, like her feet were sinking into invisible tar. She reached the fail-safe panel just as Cross punched in the activation code. 10 seconds, Cross shouted. From the darkness, 14 stepped closer. His body was massive now, his skin no longer just stone but something ancient, something that pulsed with the memory of an entire civilization lost to time. He lifted a hand toward them, and Eleanor felt it, the pull of gravity itself shifting. Stone was forming over her skin. She could feel her fingers calcifying, her breath slowing, the whispers in her skull begging her to submit. Her vision blurred. Cross grabbed her arm, yanking her back. "No, keep moving." The countdown hit 3 seconds. Eleanor slammed the failsafe activation switch. The world exploded. The silence after the fall. Darkness. A deep, crushing silence settled over the ruins of Site-42. The explosion had caved in the entire underground facility, burying everything, including SCP-014, under tons of reinforced stone and steel. No movement, no sound. The stone plague had stopped. Or at least it had gone silent. Eleanor lay sprawled on the cold dirt outside the blast zone, coughing as dust filled her lungs. Cross was beside her, blood running down his face, staring at the collapsed ruins. "Did it work?" Eleanor whispered. Cross didn't answer right away. His eyes were locked on something in the distance. Eleanor followed his gaze. Amid the rubble, a single, standing monolith remained. It wasn't part of the facility. It wasn't part of any known structure. It was new, and it bore the unmistakable shape of SCP-014's face. Expressionless, watching. Eleanor swallowed hard. Cross exhaled. "The stone doesn't die, does it?" She stared at the monolith, feeling an unbearable weight in her chest. "No." She clenched her fists. "It waits."